Hey everyone. This week we'll venture into the wild world of the short story. We have several stories to read that I hope set us up for later parts of this course and give us a sense of what the short story form can do. I've tried to include something for everybody: humor, drama, serious interpersonal issues, class and racial divides, the whole bag. All of the stories we're reading have been written in the later part of the 20th century or the beginning of the 21st century. So I can't say we're getting a comprehensive view of the history of the American short story, but I hope that what we lose in completeness, we make up for with depth and enjoyment. First up, we have a recurring writer in this class, Raymond Carver, and his most famous story, Cathedral. We'll be looking at a few stories from his book, What We Talk About When We Talk About Love, next week. Also this week, we'll look at one of America's finest writers, Toni Morrison. She's mostly known for her novels, such as Beloved, Song of Solomon, and The Bluest Eye, but we're going to look at the only short story that she's published, entitled Recitatif. And then, lastly for this week, we'll look at Jonathan Lethem's Super Goat Man, a lampoon of the superhero genre, a humorous take on the anti-hero tropes and 1960s bohemian hippie culture. Furthermore, we'll be talking about the main tools we use to analyze short stories, including understanding them through plot development, character development, narratorial technique, the influence of setting, and then some other ideas we'll borrow from poetry, such as symbolism and metaphor. First up, Cathedral. It's hard to imagine a less likable narrator. He's selfish, arrogant, openly racist, deeply prejudiced, jealous to a warped degree, shallow. There's not much great about him, which makes him an excellent candidate for redemption. And when we read Cathedral, I want us to keep an eye on those redemptive qualities and where they come from. We can think of this story as a good opportunity to consider the effects of the first-person narrative, where we get the story told from a single character's voice and perspective. We are put into the driver's seat of the brain of this despicable person, and we're asked to see the world as he sees it, however painful that might be. I want you to think about what changes this man, how he goes about changing into a slightly better person, maybe. This touches on a number of archetypes. Oftentimes there is a person in need of redemption, then there's a conduit or a facilitator, and then there's a redeemer, a kind of priest or visionary who can allow this person in need of redemption a clearer view of their predicament. In this story, these roles are obvious. I'll let you figure out who's who for yourself. The change is not enacted in any old circumstance, though. There needs to be a spark, and typically that spark comes from ritual. In this case, the ritual is clear as well. It has to do with eating, drinking, smoking pot, and making art. These ritualistic acts of communal property and shared experience open up the narrative for redemption. And it's through the careful analysis of religious buildings that the redemption is fully realized, at least for the night. Maybe. It's what provokes him to say, anyway, quote, "I was in my house, I knew that, but I didn't feel like I was inside anything," unquote. I'll ask you to read the story carefully with these ideas in mind and seek out those passages where the character's opening up occurs. Next, let's quickly talk about Toni Morrison's Recitatif, a story of two girls who meet in a foster home as young people and their subsequent run-ins as adults on two sides of a world divided by race and class. Morrison's most interesting move here, though, is to prevent readers from knowing what the races of the girls are. We have to guess. And in guessing, we are making assumptions. We are using the stereotypes that society has handed us. The story asks us to examine our own assumptions and why we make them. It asks us to wonder to ourselves, in the most intimate way, why we judge experience the way we do, what knee-jerk reactions we make about race. Ultimately, it asks us to question our deepest thoughts regarding race and class. Not a bad feat for a story you could devour in an hour-long sitting. Here's how Morrison put it in an interview. She says, "I wrote a story entitled Recitatif in which there are two little girls in an orphanage, one white and one black, but the reader doesn't know which is white and which is black. I use class codes, but no racial codes. Then the interviewer asks, "Is this meant to confuse the reader?" And Morrison responds, "Well, yes, but to provoke and enlighten. I did that as a lark. What was exciting was to be forced as a writer not to be lazy and rely on obvious codes. Soon as I say, 'black woman,' I can rest on or provoke predictable responses. But if I leave it out, then I have to talk about her in a complicated way, as a person." Unquote. Super Goatman's goals are perhaps slightly less noble, but if you can catch the cultural references, mostly in relation to 60s and 70s revolutionary counterculture and intellectuals such as Sergei Eisenstein and Thomas Pynchon, it's a lot of fun, and plays with our ideas of what a superhero is and what one is capable of in some interesting ways. In this way, it's somewhat like Recitatif and Cathedral, in that it asks us to question our preconceptions and expectations and replace them with new, less presumptive attitudes. And we see this story through the eyes of a young boy learning about his parents and then about his peers through his experiences with a washed-up superhero whose actions never really rise to the level of heroic. In some ways, this piece asks us why we put our heroes on a pedestal at all. We know people are personally flawed and their acts of heroism are aberrations of their normal behavior. But this is an exaggeration of both of these facts. There's also some Freudian exploration here, as our narrator sees first his mother entranced by Super Goatman and then learns that his wife had had an affair with him before they were married. The narrator here in his development is worth putting onto the psychologist's couch, but I'll leave it to you to do the questioning. But at the very least, I want you to keep in mind that even in Super Goatman, we confront a character who is dynamic, who changes, who develops, and in that is where we find the common motive in all of these short stories. While most of the real power of these stories comes from character development, I'd like you to keep the other tools in mind as well. Consider, for example, setting. The writers each create, in their own way, very vivid places for these stories to play out. Consider how setting relates to plot. Consider the many ways that these writers develop complex ideas and create real people and events in their fictional works. And in such examination, in entering those worlds, we make them part of ourselves. We learn about people who help us better understand our own relationships, attitudes, and patterns of mind.